Sup, homie students. Welcome to Iain Talks History, as we take an awesome journey through a period of time in a place that existed. Today we are going to be talking about history source material, the kinds of source material that you'll deal with in historical research, and the kinds of questions that you can legitimately ask different types of sources. What I want you to remember as we go through this is that questions and sources must line up correctly. Historical thinking begins with good research. This is an evidence-based area of inquiry that critically analyzes human-created records in order to understand past societies and lived human experiences. Basically, the things we study are created by people with complex motivations and perspectives, and we need to be able to effectively analyze those motivations and perspectives to understand the material that people have left us. Critical thinking is essential when evaluating all kinds of source material. There are a lot of gray zones in history, as we will see with newspaper articles, so it is very important to understand the nature of your question, because that is what will determine whether the source material you're looking at is primary, secondary, or some variation between. Critical thinking is essential when evaluating all historical documents. There are a lot of gray areas in history, as we will see with newspaper articles, so it is very important to critically evaluate the documents that you are using to understand what kinds of questions you can legitimately ask them. We usually divide sources into primary and secondary based on the relationship between the individual creating the source and the topic that we are researching. It is our questions that determine what is primary and what is secondary. I would like to suggest a slightly more complex division of source material to help you fine-tune the most useful sources for your specific research. Direct primary sources, like this diary page of Admiral Henry Keppel, are a record of an individual's daily life and experiences. The creator is an individual recording their personal experiences and views, and that is what we are interested in researching. Some other common examples of primary sources include letters, like this one from Admiral Sir Edmund Fremantle to Admiral Sir Richard V.C. Hamilton. It is a record at a specific time and place, signed and dated. You can also see the frequent need to save paper and write the signature above the dedication of the letter to avoid using a second sheet of paper. We also have institutional documents, like the first report of the Colonial Defense Committee that was created by an official body in the course of its duties. These kinds of sources can be vital for understanding policy decisions and the political process at various points in the past. Of course, sometimes we have the best of both worlds. An 1896 cabinet note recording the government's decision to increase naval spending yet again. There are other kinds of primary sources, like photographs or videos or many others, but I expect history students will most likely be working with documentary evidence. After all, the Rosetta Stone is a primary source, recording a government policy decision to institute a ruler's cult. Indirect primary sources, like this article from the Army and Navy Gazette, were created by an observer or a contemporary to the events that they are discussing or describing. These sources are generally focused on recording and compiling information as an observer, not as a direct participant to the events. These sources are further removed from the facts on the ground, and so are not the best choice if we want to research events themselves. They are far more useful if we step a little farther back and think about society as a whole, how the public reacted to a particular event rather than the experience of that event itself. Besides newspaper and magazine articles, which are the most frequent and common indirect primary sources that students will use, you may also run across things like memoirs, which would fall into this category, as an observer recording their somewhat distant perceptions of that particular event or process. To help make sense of secondary sources, I will divide them into intermediate, popular, and academic secondary sources. Each of these types of sources has its usefulness, but there are also significant limitations to different kinds of source material. Intermediate secondary sources consist of academic articles or scholarly works that are significantly out of date. Items like this Transactions of the Institute of Naval Architects appears to be a very solid, scholarly, scientific kind of publication. Oh. You can see here that we have 1885. This source is significantly out of date, and we should hope that we've learned a lot in the last 140 years, and so this source is no longer a desirable secondary source for our historical research. A good rule of thumb is to avoid anything that was published more than 60 years ago. This will remove the most obsolete and outdated material, but still leave you with a very large pool of academic sources. A legitimate question to ask this kind of material is intellectual history. So how academics and thinkers have changed their opinions and their attitudes in history. It is a mixture, an intermediate stage between primary and secondary source material. Popular secondary sources are those written for amusement or general interest. They often have significant weaknesses in research or factual knowledge and are generally unreliable. You know that I'm thinking of Wikipedia and other online encyclopedias. These have usefulness. If you knew nothing about the Royal Navy except that you wanted to know more, you could start with the Wikipedia page for the Royal Navy that you see here, and it would tell you a lot of the major issues, the main framework of the history of the Navy, and would give you a foundation to begin looking for better sources, to give you the search terms, the keywords, the further reading that will allow you to construct an effective research project. These are a tool to begin your research. They are not the research itself. Internet blogs and modern newspaper articles are an equally common mistake students make when choosing research sources for their papers. A modern newspaper article does not have the scholarly research or credentials to be a viable secondary source. It is not written to be used as a history research source. It is written for the general interest of the public, and these should be avoided. The only time that these sources can be legitimately used in history papers is if you are considering issues of memory and commemoration, in which case you are using them as a primary source to tell us about how people today, or when that newspaper article was published, are choosing to remember and celebrate particular historical events, people, or concepts. Academic secondary sources are relatively current scholarly articles or books that have been put through a peer review and publication process. Monographs, books, like those you see behind me, are a reliable source for good historical information. Check the author and publisher on Google to find out if they have proper scholarly credentials. As college students, you are probably thinking, what about my textbook? This is one of those gray areas that I mentioned. Your textbook absolutely has scholarly credentials. It is written by capable people and published through an academic press. It has gone through a peer review process. In general, your textbook is the best place to find context and background for your topic, but it should be used for no more than a few lines to introduce your paper, It is not a main research source. The most useful category for students is probably the academic research article, as you see here. This article would be published in the last 60 years in a reputable journal, which you can confirm through Google, and will present original historical research. Reviews, review essays, and historiographical articles are all valid academic secondary sources, but they should be avoided for the purpose of writing undergraduate history papers. Your history papers should rely on primary source evidence to get to the root of a historical problem or controversy, and then use secondary sources to help you fit what you find in the primary sources into the larger historical discourse. History is a conversation, and primary sources allow you to make your contribution to the larger secondary source discussions. That brings us to a close of this video. At this point, you should have a solid grasp of primary and secondary sources and the types of sources that we can use for specific kinds of research. I introduced a more complex division of primary sources into direct and indirect primary sources to help you understand which sources will be the most useful for your research. I divided secondary sources into intermediate, popular, and academic in order for you to better choose the sources to rely on for your knowledge and information. Success in history is ultimately about hard work. It doesn't matter how well you can write if you don't know what you're talking about. The biggest problem that I see with students is a lack of engagement in the research process. Good research will carry you farther than good writing. Remember, history is complicated, so read more.